The war had ended, but the silence it left behind screamed louder than any explosion. After Vietnam, America was wounded, not just in spirit, but in strategy. Hundreds of aircraft had been lost to simple Soviet missiles and outdated anti-air systems. Jets that once symbolized unstoppable power were falling like flies in the jungle. What good was speed? What good was firepower? If the enemy could see you coming. In the sterile halls of the Pentagon, there was no applause for returning pilots. Only questions, the kind that generals don't like to ask out loud. What if our enemies didn't need bigger guns, just better eyes? What if the next war wouldn't be won by dominance, but by disappearance? From that fear, something radical was born. Not a new jet, not a new weapon, a new way of thinking. In the late 1970s, a quiet revolution began, not in the skies, but on paper. In the depths of Lockheed's Skunk Works division, buried behind layers of classification and guarded access points, a handful of engineers were chasing a ghost, radar invisibility. The challenge was absurd on its face. Make an aircraft that can fly, carry weapons, and somehow vanish. Not from sight, but from sensors, from radar, from the digital eyes that painted targets in green and sent missiles screaming toward their path. The story of the F-117 is just the beginning. If you want to see inside the machines that changed the course of history, join us. Hit subscribe and get ready to see the invisible. One of them, Dennis Overholser, found something most engineers would have ignored, a Russian scientific paper from the 1960s, authored by Pyotr Ufimtsev. It laid out the theoretical mathematics of radar reflection from flat surfaces. Not exactly thrilling reading for most, but to Overholser, it was gold. And to Ben Rich, then head of Skunk Works, it was a roadmap to build the impossible. They began with a shape. Angular, almost alien. No curves, no beauty. Just flat panels, sharp edges, and a profile that looked more like a stealth bomber from a sci-fi novel than any aircraft in the American arsenal. They called the prototype Have Blue, and it didn't just look strange to fly, it flew strange too. It was unstable by design. So unstable, in fact, that no human pilot could have kept it in the air without help. To keep it from flipping out of control, engineers built one of the first fully digital fly-by-wire systems. The aircraft wasn't flown, it was managed by computers, constantly adjusting every surface a dozen times per second. Without those calculations, the plane would fall from the sky in seconds. But it worked. Have Blue flew. And when it did, something astonishing happened. Radar systems couldn't find it. Towers scanned the skies, expecting a return signal, a blip, a whisper. Nothing. It was like trying to see your own shadow in the dark. The jet was there, but it wasn't. The pilots who flew it were briefed behind closed doors and debriefed in silence. They took off in secret and landed in darkness. Sometimes they weren't allowed to see the jet fully assembled. It wasn't just secret, it was mythic. In one early flight, a test pilot joked that it felt like flying a filing cabinet. Boxy, awkward, and barely responsive. But when the radar readings came in, no one was laughing. The monster they'd built was practically invisible. The impossible was becoming real, but stealth came at a cost. Aerodynamically, the aircraft was a nightmare. Those sharp angles and flat surfaces might fool radar, but they also made for unstable airflow. Engineers were constantly walking a tightrope. Every gain in stealth risked a loss in control. Every change in surface threatened to break the fragile balance that kept it in the air. Even paint became a factor. Special coatings had to be developed to absorb radar waves, and these needed reapplication constantly. Stealth wasn't a switch you flipped. It was a condition you had to maintain, and defend with everything you had. Then came the question, if we can build a prototype, can we build a fleet? The Pentagon answered with black budgets and classified contracts. The project went deeper underground. Engineers were now designing a full-scale production aircraft, a fighter that didn't fight like any other. It didn't need speed, it didn't need agility, it just needed to sneak in, strike, and disappear before anyone knew what happened. A ghost in the sky. The plane was eventually named the F-117, a designation that broke all naming conventions. There was no F-116, no earlier series. The number was chosen deliberately as misdirection. The plane itself didn't follow the rules, so why should its name? The Air Force publicly denied its existence. Even as production ramped up and dozens were built, their very presence was omitted from records, their flight logs erased, their hangars marked with false identifiers. At night, they flew from the Nevada desert. No navigation lights, no transponders, and no second chances. Each mission was a gamble against physics and probability. But they flew, and not a single one was ever seen by radar. They were ghosts, and they were real. Still, in those years before its official reveal, the world could only speculate. Amateur photographers captured strange silhouettes against twilight skies. Locals near Area 51 reported hearing something unnatural in the air. A deep hum, a sound with no visible source. Theories multiplied. Was it alien technology? A secret NASA spacecraft? No one guessed the truth. It was an American weapon so advanced it had no counterpart. But deep in Groom Lake, the legend was growing stronger. Test by test, the F-117 was proving itself. And the day would come when it would emerge from the shadows not just as a proof of concept, but as a weapon of war. The world wasn't ready to see it, and the skies weren't ready to hide from it. And yet, the question remained, could a plane built on secrets and instability survive the chaos of real combat? That answer would come soon, in a desert far from Nevada, under a sky lit by missiles, where the invisible would finally become unstoppable. By the early 1980s, the Ghost had a heartbeat. The F-117, forged in secrecy and cloaked in myth, was no longer just an experimental aircraft. It was becoming a weapon, but it still didn't officially exist. On paper, it was known only as the Senior Trend Program. Its blueprints were locked away. Its flights occurred under the cover of darkness. Its pilots had no glory, no medals, and no names. Every moment of the F-117's life was shadowed in misdirection. While the world debated the capabilities of the F-15 and the Soviet MiG-29, something far more radical was preparing for a new kind of war. This wasn't a dogfighter. It wasn't designed to outmaneuver enemies or dominate in air-to-air combat. It was designed to slip through the most sophisticated defenses in the world without a whisper, drop precision bombs on strategic targets, and vanish into the night before anyone knew it had come. Its base of operations was Tonopah Test Range Airport, a remote, barren airstrip in the Nevada desert. Isolated and patrolled, it was the perfect home for a plane that was never meant to be seen. Pilots stationed there lived double lives. Their families thought they flew standard training missions. In truth, they were preparing to enter hostile airspace without ever being detected, flying the most unstable, unforgiving aircraft the U.S. Air Force had ever built. Flying the F-117 wasn't like piloting anything else. Every control surface, every adjustment, every twitch of the stick was mediated by software. The aircraft had no aerodynamic stability of its own. It was constantly on the edge of chaos. It wasn't a plane you commanded. It was a system you negotiated with. One pilot described it like this: it felt like walking a tightrope in a windstorm, blindfolded while juggling knives. But still, it worked, because the computers never blinked. Every second, the flight control system made hundreds of adjustments, small, precise corrections that kept the aircraft from tumbling into oblivion. The price of stealth was constant attention, constant trust in technology, and zero room for error. At first, only a handful of F-117s took to the air. Training was meticulous, flights were limited. But as the 1980s progressed, more aircraft rolled out of the secretive Skunk Works hangars and more pilots were recruited into the program. Each of them sworn to silence. Each of them trained to forget that the world outside even existed. They flew only at night. They never saw the aircraft in daylight. Hangars were equipped with blackout systems. Every mission, every maintenance task, every detail was monitored, recorded, and buried under layers of classified clearance. Yet the secret couldn't last forever. Strange sightings began to surface in the southwestern United States. Local residents reported black, angular aircraft cutting through the dusk sky, silent and fast. Amateur photographers caught blurry images of something that looked like a shadow with wings. The rumors spread. Area 51 was testing alien technology, something not of this Earth. The truth was stranger. Not alien, but American. A machine so far ahead of its time, it simply didn't look real. Inside the Pentagon, pressure was mounting. Satellite surveillance from foreign powers was improving. Journalists were getting too close. And most of all, the time was approaching when this secret weapon would be needed, not just as a prototype, but as a tool of war. The U.S. Department of Defense made a decision. It was time to confirm the existence of the F-117 without really revealing it. In November 1988, the Pentagon issued a brief press release. It admitted that the U.S. Air Force had developed a stealth fighter. No photos, no specs, no details. Just a name, the F-117 Nighthawk. A ghost had been named, but it still had no face. Even after its acknowledgement, the aircraft remained wrapped in mystery. Public appearances were limited to blurry satellite images and speculative artist renderings. The first actual photo of the F-117 wouldn't be released until April 1990, and even then, it was a carefully staged shot taken at a distance in controlled lighting. The government wanted to show just enough to silence rumors, and nothing more. But the reveal sparked a global reaction. Military analysts scrambled to understand what this stealth technology really meant. If the U.S. had developed a plane that could slip past radar, it wasn't just a technological breakthrough. It was a strategic revolution. Suddenly, no enemy installation could be considered safe, no radar system could be trusted, and no war could be planned without accounting for the possibility of an invisible attacker. Within defense circles around the world, the calculus changed overnight. Nations began pouring money into radar-absorbent materials, into passive detection systems, into anti-stealth research. They knew the game had shifted, and they were already behind. For the pilots of the F-117, little changed. Even after the official reveal, their operations remained in the dark. Every mission, every takeoff, every landing was still covered by secrecy protocols. But now they knew that when the time came, when their services were called upon, They would not be entering the unknown. They would be entering history. Behind the closed doors of Tonopah, mission plans began to shift. Real targets were being discussed, real war zones. The Gulf was heating up. Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990 triggered a global crisis. Coalition forces were mobilizing, and buried inside that strategy was a role for the F-117, not a support role, not a test, a leading role. First in, first strike. The question was no longer whether the plane could fly, it was whether it could survive a real battlefield. Could it penetrate the densest air defense network in the world? Could it strike high-value targets with absolute precision? Could a plane built in the shadows redefine how wars were fought? The pilots prepared in silence. They practiced in simulated radar environments, using real maps of Baghdad, real layouts of enemy air defenses. They memorized routes. They drilled procedures. Every flight was a rehearsal for a war that hadn't started yet, but everyone knew it was coming. And then the call came. On January 16, 1991, in the blackest hours of the night, the F-117s took off from bases in Saudi Arabia. No formation lights, no transponders. Each jet flew alone, cloaked by design, shielded by darkness. Their mission, cripple Iraq's command and control infrastructure before the first bombs of Operation Desert Storm began to fall. They slipped across the border unnoticed. Iraqi radar operators saw nothing. Their screens remained quiet. And then, out of nowhere, command centers exploded. Communications hubs vanished. Runways were shattered. In minutes, the enemy's nerve system was paralyzed. And not a single F-117 was hit. What happened that night didn't just validate decades of secret development. It shattered the traditional model of air warfare. For the first time in history, the sky belonged to the invisible. But this was only the beginning. The F-117 had drawn first blood. The world had just seen a glimpse of what was coming next. The night sky over Baghdad looked peaceful, quiet. But at 2:38 a.m. on January 17, 1991, that silence shattered. Without warning, explosions ripped through radar stations, communication hubs, and key command posts across Iraq. The enemy never saw it coming. No alarm, no warning. Just sudden, devastating precision. And by the time they realized what had happened, it was too late. That night, 20 F-117 Nighthawks flew into one of the most heavily defended airspaces on Earth. The Iraqis had spent years building a dense, overlapping network of radar and anti-aircraft systems, Soviet-built SAMs, ZSU-23-4 Shilka mobile guns, dozens of early warning stations. On paper, it was a nightmare. Any traditional aircraft would have been torn from the sky before it got within miles of its target. But the F-117 wasn't traditional. The mission was codenamed Senior Surprise, though the pilots had another name for it, Secret Squirrel. It was the operational debut of stealth warfare, not just theory, but execution. And it didn't disappoint. Every aircraft reached its target, every bomb hit with surgical precision, and every pilot returned safely, untouched, unseen. For the Iraqi command, it was chaos. Their systems hadn't failed, they simply couldn't see. It was as if their eyes had been plucked out of the sky. High-value sites were destroyed before the first wave of traditional fighters even took off. The F-117 had cracked the door open, and now the full might of coalition air power was pouring through. In the days that followed, the Nighthawks continued to strike. Deep targets, hardened bunkers, underground facilities. Their loadout was small, usually just two 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs, but it was enough, because these weren't carpet bombing missions. These were scalpel cuts. A single F-117 could cripple an air operations center, neutralize a power substation, or destroy a chemical weapons facility, and vanish before a single alarm was raised. If you're fascinated by real stories hidden in the shadows of war and technology, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Here, every video reveals what the world was never meant to see. One mission in particular became legend: the bombing of the Iraqi Ministry of Defense in downtown Baghdad. Protected by multiple layers of radar and anti-air artillery, the building was considered virtually untouchable. Yet, in the dead of night, a single F-117 slipped through the defenses, dropped its payload through a specific window on the upper floor, and exited the area without so much as a scratch. The precision was so exact that Iraqi analysts initially believed the damage had come from a saboteur or an inside attack. They couldn't believe a plane had done this, and they certainly couldn't believe it had done so without being seen. Inside the Pentagon, jaws dropped, not because they doubted the F-117's capabilities, but because it worked even better than expected. The stealth systems held up under real combat conditions. The electronic warfare suites remained undetected. Even basic infrared tracking systems struggled to keep pace. The plane was doing exactly what it was built to do: disappear. And yet, as the war dragged on, the F-117's aura of invincibility began to stir new questions. If this was the future of air combat, what came next? Could stealth technology be scaled? Could it be adapted to faster, more versatile platforms? The Nighthawk had proven the concept. Now the race was on to evolve it. Meanwhile, the pilots of the F-117 continued their missions with an almost religious level of discipline. Each sortie was rehearsed, each target mapped, each escape route memorized down to the second. They flew alone, without escort, without backup. If anything went wrong, a mechanical failure, a navigation error, a bomb that didn't release, they were on their own. No one was coming to rescue them. That was the deal. Stealth was strength, but it was also isolation. And yet, none were lost. By the end of the Gulf War, F-117s had flown over 200 sorties and dropped more than 2,000 tons of precision munitions. They accounted for less than 2.5% of coalition aircraft, but were assigned to over 40% of the most critical targets. That wasn't coincidence. It was strategy. When something absolutely had to be destroyed, with no margin for error and no second chance, the Nighthawk got the call, and the world was watching. In military briefings, generals began to talk about surgical warfare. News anchors showed grainy footage of bombs entering buildings through air vents. The term smart bomb entered the public vocabulary, and with it, a kind of techno-optimism. War, it seemed, was becoming cleaner, more precise, more humane. But what most people didn't see, what only the pilots and ground crews knew, was just how much of that depended on a fragile dance of secrecy, training, and trust in machines. The Nighthawk wasn't easy to fly, it wasn't forgiving, and while it looked futuristic, its technology was, by the early 90s, already starting to age. Its computer systems were primitive by modern standards, its engines were loud, inefficient, and emitted a heat signature that modern infrared sensors could detect if close enough. But none of that mattered, because its shape still worked, its profile still confused radar, and its pilots still believed in the mission. But belief only goes so far. Behind the scenes, adversaries were adapting. Radar operators in hostile nations began modifying their systems. They started using longer wavelengths, setting up overlapping coverage zones, watching not for the aircraft themselves, but for the absences, the ghost shadows, the gaps, the telltale disruptions in signal flow that sometimes meant something was there. And over time, those absences started to matter. Yet, for a few years, the F-117 remained untouchable. It continued to fly secretive missions in Iraq, Bosnia, and elsewhere. Targets that needed to disappear, quietly, cleanly, without international headlines, were assigned to the jet that didn't officially exist until a few years ago. It became a symbol not just of American air superiority, but of technological arrogance. The idea that any enemy, no matter how well defended, could be cracked open with the right tools. But arrogance has a cost, and history was about to deliver a reminder. Because somewhere across the ocean, in a country torn by ethnic war and NATO intervention, a group of radar technicians were watching, studying, and preparing for the night when they would make the impossible happen. The F-117 had stunned the world, but nothing remains invisible forever. The myth of invincibility didn't die with a roar. It died with a sharp crack in the sky above Serbia, a sound the world wasn't supposed to hear. For over a decade, the F-117 had remained untouchable. It had slipped through enemy airspace, destroyed hardened targets, and returned without a scratch. It was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol, a ghost in the night that proved American dominance didn't need to shout. It could whisper. But on March 27, 1999, the whisper was intercepted. That night, during Operation Allied Force, an F-117 was tasked with striking targets near Belgrade. It was a mission like many before. The route had been planned, the defenses mapped, the flight rehearsed. The pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Dale Zelko, was experienced. The weather was typical. The radar threat was considered manageable. And yet, somewhere on the ground, hidden beneath camouflage netting and protected by decades-old Soviet hardware, a Serbian missile crew waited. They weren't operating cutting-edge equipment. Their primary weapon was the S-125 Niva, known to NATO as the SA-3 Goa, a system designed in the 1960s. Slow to set up, limited in range, and designed to counter high-flying aircraft. But what they lacked in tech, they made up for in cunning. The man in charge, Colonel Zoltan Dani, had been watching. He'd been studying the patterns of stealth aircraft. He knew the F-117s flew at roughly the same time each night. He knew their approach routes were often similar, and more importantly, he understood the one weakness that stealth couldn't completely erase: predictability. That night, Danny's crew operated differently. They kept their radars off, avoiding detection. They listened. They calculated. Then, at just the right moment for a few brief seconds, they switched their radar on, enough to catch a glimpse of something odd. A faint return. A ripple where there should have been silence. They fired. 2 missiles streaked skyward. One missed. The other didn't. At 8:15 p.m., over the village of Bujanovci, the unthinkable happened. The F-117 was hit. A section of the fuselage exploded. Systems failed. The aircraft buckled and went dark. Zelko ejected, falling into enemy territory. The black triangle that had once flown unchallenged over Baghdad now plummeted into a field of dirt and disbelief. Zelko survived. He evaded capture, was rescued by a NATO search and rescue team, and eventually returned to duty. But the jet, what remained of it, didn't disappear. The wreckage was found. Pieces of the stealth skin, the radar-absorbing material, the shape once so sacred, all were examined, photographed, and displayed. Part of the fuselage still hangs today in a museum in Belgrade. Another piece reportedly found its way to Moscow, maybe even to Beijing. The myth had been pierced. For the U.S. Air Force, it was a sobering moment, not just because they'd lost an aircraft, but because it had been brought down by a system older than most of the pilots flying at the time. Stealth was never supposed to mean invincible, but for years it had felt that way. This event forced a reassessment. Yet, even in defeat, the F-117 proved something extraordinary. It had entered one of the most heavily monitored airspaces in Europe, been targeted by outdated hardware, and still managed to keep its pilot alive and evade capture. Most traditional jets hit by a surface-to-air missile wouldn't have offered the same chance. Its design, while compromised, still gave its operator enough time and stability to eject safely and survive. And despite this highly publicized incident, the F-117 continued flying. Missions didn't stop, adjustments were made, routes were varied, countermeasures refined, but the platform still had value. It still brought something no other aircraft could fully replicate at the time: access. When a target was too dangerous, too politically sensitive, or too fortified for anything else, the Nighthawk was still a contender. But behind closed doors, a successor was already being prepared. By the early 2000s, the Air Force knew the stealth revolution had to evolve. The F-117 was a pioneer, but it was never meant to be the final word. It had no radar, no afterburner, no defensive weapons. It could carry only 2 bombs. And worst of all, its stealth only worked against certain radar frequencies. As global adversaries adapted, these limitations became harder to ignore. Enter the F-22 Raptor. Faster, more agile, and built from the ground up to combine stealth with air superiority. And behind it, the F-35 Lightning II, a versatile networked multi-role stealth fighter for the next generation. Compared to these, the F-117 began to look like a relic from a different era. Still elegant, still effective, but limited. In 2006, the U.S. Air Force announced the official retirement of the F-117 program. It was a quiet goodbye, no fanfare, no final flyover. In April 2008, the last of the operational Nighthawks made its final flight to Tonopah, where it would be sealed away in protective storage. Not scrapped, not destroyed, but preserved, as if the Air Force wasn't quite ready to let go. And maybe they weren't, because for years after its retirement, strange sightings began to surface again. Reports from military observers in California and Nevada described black, angular aircraft flying low over the desert, aircraft that looked suspiciously like the F-117. In 2020, the Air Force confirmed what many had suspected. Some Nighthawks had been pulled out of storage for limited flight testing. Why? No one said. Perhaps to test new radar systems, perhaps to train pilots in detecting low, observable targets, or perhaps because ghosts never rest easy. To this day, a few F-117s still take to the sky. Not for war, not for glory, but because their story isn't entirely finished. Their legacy, however, is already etched in the DNA of every stealth platform flying today. The F-117 didn't just redefine what a fighter jet could be. It redefined how wars could be fought. It taught military strategists that silence could be more powerful than noise, that precision could be more devastating than brute force, that victory could come from a shadow drifting across the radar like a whisper. But behind the engineering, beyond the strategy, the Nighthawk represented something more. It was a leap of faith, in math, in theory, in courage, a triumph not just of machines, but of the people who believed in the impossible, the engineers who designed it, the pilots who trusted it, the teams who kept it flying, and the nation that dared to dream that invisibility was more than just a fantasy. And, while newer jets have taken the spotlight, none have captured the imagination in quite the same way. Because the F-117 wasn't supposed to exist, it was a secret, a myth, a weapon shaped like a question mark. And that question still echoes, decades later. If we could make that invisible, what comes next?